Chapter 1. A World of Suspicion. Life often feels like a simple routine. You wake up, go through your daily motions, and return home to a place that's meant to be safe and familiar. But for Mariah, that comfort was slowly crumbling away. The routine she once found comforting now felt like a cage, and it all started with the strange, subtle changes in her husband's behavior. Nothing too blatant, but enough to spark a sense of unease in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something hidden just beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. It had been a Thursday morning when it all started. The sun was already shining brightly through the window, casting a warm glow across the living room of their modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Mariah sat on the couch, nursing her coffee, a thick stack of paperwork for her job at the local marketing firm in front of her. She could hear the sound of the shower running upstairs, the gentle rhythm of it a stark contrast to the constant buzzing in her mind. Her husband, David, had always been a loving partner, attentive, affectionate, and always home by dinner. Their life wasn't extraordinary, but it was comfortable. The kind of life Mariah had dreamed of when she was younger. The kind that many people longed for. Yet, in the past few weeks, something had changed in him. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started, but she felt it in the air between them. The silence after dinner had grown thicker. The once easy flow of conversation felt strained, like a conversation they were both too tired to finish. Mariah put her mug down, tapping her fingers nervously on the edge of the table. She had noticed the late nights, the quick exits after dinner, the subtle avoidance of her gaze. He'd stop in the middle of their conversations, as if something was occupying his mind more than her, his eyes darting toward his phone with increasing frequency. She tried to brush it off at first. People get busy, right? Work, stress, life in general. Maybe it was all just catching up with him. But the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. Her instincts told her there was something more to it, something she wasn't seeing. And that scared her. "Hey babe," she called up the stairs, trying to keep her tone casual, even though her heart was pounding. "What's the plan for tonight? You coming home for dinner?" There was a brief pause before she heard him answer. "I don't know, maybe. I've got a late meeting." His voice seemed distant, his words clipped. Mariah swallowed, forcing herself to take another sip of her coffee. There it was again, that tone. The same tone he'd been using for the past week, one that didn't quite match the David she knew. The David who used to look at her like she was the most important thing in the world. "Okay," she said, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Let me know when you get in. I'll keep dinner warm." Another pause. Then, the sound of the shower turning off. Mariah took a deep breath and stared out the window, trying to push the discomfort from her mind. But it lingered, a low hum in the background of her thoughts. She tried to focus on her work, flipping through her notes, but the words began to blur. She couldn't concentrate. Just then, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, grateful for the distraction, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. It was Michelle, one of her closest friends since college. "Hey girl, what's up?" Mariah answered, trying to sound upbeat. "You won't believe what I heard." Michelle's voice was filled with excitement, and it instantly piqued Mariah's curiosity. "You know David's friend from work, Jason?" Mariah frowned, thinking for a moment. "Yeah, I know Jason. What about him?" "Well, I overheard him talking to someone yesterday at the coffee shop. He was saying something about how David's been acting weird lately. And I swear, it sounded like he was talking about someone else. Maybe another woman." Mariah's breath caught in her throat. She felt her grip on the phone tighten as her mind raced. It was like a punch to the gut, an unexpected blow that left her reeling. Jason. Of all people, why was he talking about David like this? "Wait, hold on," Mariah stammered. "Are you sure?" "I'm not saying anything for sure, but girl, you know how rumors spread, right? I just thought you should know. Be careful, okay?" Mariah was silent for a moment, processing the information. The idea of David, the man she had spent the last 5 years of her life with, being involved with another woman seemed unfathomable. He'd never given her a reason to doubt him. But now, this uncertainty gnawed at her. "Thanks for letting me know," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "No problem," Michelle replied, her tone more serious now. "Just keep your eyes open, Mariah. I don't want you to get blindsided." Mariah didn't know how to respond. Her mind was already spinning, replaying every moment, every conversation with David over the past week. Had she missed something? Had there been signs she had ignored? She hung up the phone, feeling a rush of cold air fill the room, even though the heat from the sun still blazed outside. Her heart raced, and her thoughts felt like a blur of confusion and fear. She needed answers. She couldn't just let this suspicion fester without confronting it. Her eyes darted toward the stairs as David emerged from the bedroom, freshly dressed, his shirt tucked neatly into his pants. He gave her a quick smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. That same look, the one she had begun to dread, flickered for just a moment before he turned away to grab his briefcase. "Heading out?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yeah, got a busy day ahead." He paused, looking over his shoulder. "I'll be late again, okay?" Mariah nodded, her stomach tight. She forced a smile, watching him slip out the door, the sound of the car starting outside echoing in her chest. He was gone, and with him went the sense of security she had once taken for granted. But now, all she could think about was the strange piece of information Michelle had dropped on her. Jason's words replayed in her mind, cutting through the silence like a blade. Was there another woman? Was this something that had been going on behind her back? Or was it just a misunderstanding? A rumor, maybe? The need for answers burned in her chest. And deep down, Mariah knew she had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost her. By the time David came home that night, the question had taken root, spreading like wildfire in her mind. It was no longer just suspicion. It was something much bigger. Something she couldn't ignore. He walked through the door, his tired eyes meeting hers. She could see the weight of the day in his expression, but it was something else she couldn't quite place, that kept her on edge. "How was your day?" she asked casually, but her voice shook slightly. Same old," David replied, hanging up his jacket. As he walked past her toward the kitchen, Mariah could feel the tension between them, thick and suffocating. Her heart pounded, but she knew it was time to ask the question she had been avoiding. "David, is there something you need to tell me?" His back stiffened, and he turned to face her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, one that seemed insurmountable. "I'm fine," he said after a long pause, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everything's fine. But Mariah knew. Something wasn't right. And tonight, she would find out what. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Truth. Mariah stood there, frozen in place, her eyes searching David's face for any sign that he was lying. The words, "everything's fine," hung in the air like a fragile thread ready to snap. She didn't believe him. Not anymore. The suspicions that had quietly gnawed at her earlier were now raging like a wildfire, consuming every rational thought in her mind. Her heart hammered in her chest, a constant reminder of the distance that had grown between them. David walked into the kitchen, his movements sluggish, as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He reached for the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and unscrewed the cap, his actions robotic. Mariah watched him closely, feeling the ache of betrayal sting deep in her gut. "David," she said softly, almost whispering, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile barrier between them. "I need to know what's going on. I can feel it. Something's different. You're different." He froze mid-sip, the water hovering near his lips. Slowly, he set the bottle down on the counter, his gaze finally meeting hers. It wasn't the gaze of the man she'd known for the past 5 years. There was something guarded in his eyes now, something closed off. It hurt more than she had imagined. "What do you mean?" His voice was low, but there was a sharp edge to it now, an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Mariah swallowed, her throat tight. She didn't know how to ask him directly, how to accuse him without fully knowing the truth. But the doubts had spiraled too far. She couldn't live in this limbo of uncertainty any longer. It was suffocating. "I know you've been distracted lately," she started, choosing her words carefully. "You're not the same, David. And I know I've been distant too, but I need to know what's going on. I don't want to feel like I'm in the dark." David ran a hand through his hair, his expression tightening. For a brief moment, Mariah thought she saw a flicker of guilt, but it was gone before she could be sure. He turned his back to her and walked over to the sink, as if the task of washing his hands could somehow provide an escape from the conversation. Mariah's mind raced. The possibility that he might be seeing someone else felt like a heavy weight pressing on her chest. She could barely breathe, the thought of losing him, of him betraying her in such a way, making her dizzy. She took a few steps forward, her voice growing more insistent. "David, please, just tell me the truth. You owe me that much." He let out a long, frustrated sigh before turning back to face her. There was a weariness in his eyes that made her heart ache, but there was something else too, something she couldn't quite place. I'm not seeing anyone else," he said, his voice strained. "It's not what you think." Mariah felt a strange sense of relief, but it was only temporary. His words didn't make everything better. There was still an underlying tension in the room, something unsaid hanging between them. Then, he did something unexpected. He stepped closer to her, his posture relaxed but still distant. He reached out to take her hand, a gesture she hadn't felt from him in weeks. It was almost like he was trying to reconnect, to bridge the gap that had formed between them. "You have to trust me," he continued, his voice softer now. "There's more going on, but it's not what you think." Mariah stared at their joined hands, trying to understand the weight of his words. He was hiding something, but what? If it wasn't another woman, then what was it? Why had everything changed so suddenly? What had he been keeping from her? Before she could speak again, the sound of her phone ringing cut through the air. She glanced at it and saw Michelle's name on the screen. Mariah hesitated for a moment, but the need for answers was overwhelming. "I'll be right back," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled her hand away from David's and walked to the other room, her pulse racing. The moment she answered, Michelle's voice flooded through the receiver, urgent and worried. "Girl, I swear, I think I've figured something out. You need to get to the office early tomorrow." Mariah frowned, unsure of where this conversation was headed. What are you talking about?" "I've been doing some digging, and I think I found out why David's been acting so strange," Michelle said, her tone now filled with an air of secrecy. "He's been working late for a reason, Mariah. It's not just work stuff. He's been trying to get something big." Mariah's mind whirled. "What do you mean, something big? What is it?" Michelle hesitated. "I don't want to say too much, but I think you need to talk to him about it. He's been really secretive lately, and you need to know why." The line went dead silent for a few seconds, and Mariah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" she finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Just get to his office tomorrow," Michelle said softly, her voice suddenly quieter. "I think you'll find what you're looking for." Mariah's heart raced as she hung up the phone. What could Michelle mean? What could David possibly be involved in that had him acting like this? And why hadn't he told her? She walked back into the kitchen, feeling as though the walls were closing in on her. David was standing by the counter, his back to her again, his fingers absently tapping the surface. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Mariah felt the weight of the secrets between them more than ever. "David," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to know everything. Now." David turned around, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. For the first time, Mariah saw the truth in his eyes. There was something he wasn't telling her, something bigger than she could have imagined. But what? Before he could speak, the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket interrupted the moment. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and let out a soft curse. I need to take this, he muttered, walking quickly toward the living room. I'll be right back. Mariah stood there, alone in the kitchen, her mind racing. She knew deep down that something wasn't right. The secrecy, the late nights, the phone calls. It was all adding up, and the more she tried to ignore it, the more her instincts screamed at her to dig deeper. She walked to the living room doorway, just barely peeking inside. David was standing at the window, his phone pressed to his ear, his back turned to her. His voice was low, but she could hear fragments of the conversation, words that didn't make sense. Yeah, it's almost done, he was saying. I just need a little more time. She can't know, not yet. Mariah's heart stopped. Her blood ran cold. She can't know, not yet. The words echoed in her mind. Who was he talking about? Was this about her? What had he been hiding from her? Suddenly, the room felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. She needed answers. She needed the truth. And no matter how painful it was, she was going to get it. The next morning, Mariah stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman she saw wasn't the same person who had woken up the day before. The quiet, trusting wife had been replaced by someone stronger, someone desperate for the truth. Today, she was going to find out exactly what David had been hiding. And nothing would stop her from discovering it, even if it meant uncovering things she wasn't ready to face. Chapter 3: Unraveling the Web. Mariah woke early the next morning, her mind restless from a night of half-sleep and constant questions. The moment her eyes opened, the weight of uncertainty came crashing down on her again. She had tried to push the suspicions to the back of her mind, tried to focus on something else, but it was impossible. The words from Michelle, the strange phone call, and David's cryptic behavior had left her with no choice but to act. Today, she would find out the truth, no matter where it led. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake David. His side of the bed was empty, and the bathroom door was slightly ajar. She could hear the sound of the shower running. She had always loved the mornings when they shared those few quiet moments before the world around them intruded, but today felt different. Today felt like an invasion of everything she thought she knew about him. With a deep breath, Mariah grabbed her purse and car keys from the entry table, steeling herself for what was to come. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth, but she knew she couldn't live in this haze of suspicion any longer. As she stepped out the door, the cool morning air hit her like a rush of clarity. Her drive to David's office felt like it lasted a lifetime. Her mind was a tornado of thoughts, each one spinning faster than the last. What if Michelle was wrong? What if this was all a misunderstanding? Could David really be hiding something this big from her? The thought of him with someone else, the idea that he had been living a life behind her back, made her feel sick. But even more than that, it was the lies that she felt were becoming too intricate to be just about his work. This wasn't just a simple case of him being distracted. Something deeper was at play. When she finally arrived at the office, she sat in her car for a few minutes, gathering her composure. The building was a sleek, modern structure, nothing that screamed of any kind of drama or scandal. But as Mariah stepped out and made her way inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was where everything would change. David's office was on the top floor, a corner suite with large windows that overlooked the city. It wasn't a small office, but it wasn't exactly what Mariah had expected either. The door was locked when she arrived, which felt like a strange coincidence. She glanced around the hallway. No one was around. The receptionist's desk was empty, and the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the office building made her feel even more on edge. With a deep breath, Mariah decided to act quickly. She pulled out her phone and texted Michelle. Here. The office is empty. What exactly am I looking for? The text buzzed in her hand just as she heard the elevator doors open down the hall. She quickly tucked her phone back into her purse and froze, waiting to see who was coming. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Mariah's heart began to race. It was a woman. She was dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase. Her expression was businesslike, but there was something about her that seemed too confident, too purposeful. She passed by Mariah without a second glance, but Mariah couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. She waited until the woman had disappeared around the corner before heading to the receptionist's desk. To her relief, it was still empty. Taking one more glance around, Mariah quietly walked past the desk and toward the office door. She knew she had no right to be here, to be snooping through David's things. But the curiosity, the gnawing feeling of dread, was too strong. She tried the handle. It was locked. Her heart skipped a beat. Why was it locked? Mariah hesitated for a moment, her hand still on the door. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to turn around and go home, but the desire to know the truth, to finally understand what had been happening between them, overpowered her. She couldn't back down now. She turned to the receptionist's desk again, glancing at the small cabinet underneath it. There, just inside the drawer, was a set of spare keys. Mariah's stomach twisted as she reached in and grabbed one. The metal was cold in her hand, but she didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, unlocking the door and stepping inside before anyone could catch her. The office was just as she remembered it. Sleek, modern, with dark wood paneling and clean lines. It felt empty, though. The silence in the room was deafening, and there was something about it that made her skin crawl. She walked over to the desk, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Papers were stacked neatly, as if David had been preparing for something. The desk was impeccably organized, but there was one thing that caught her eye, an open folder with documents scattered across it. She moved closer, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the papers. As she flipped through them, her breath caught in her throat. There were notes. Lists of medications, research papers, and, most shockingly, a set of medical records. Mariah's heart dropped. Why would David have medical records in his office? She scanned the papers, her mind racing as she pieced together the details. The documents seemed to relate to a rare and serious disease, one she vaguely remembered from a conversation she and David had a year ago. He had mentioned a health scare in passing, but they had never spoken about it again. But this was different. The name on the papers was not David's. It was Mariah's. Her hands shook as she took in the gravity of what she was holding. The medical records, the prescriptions, the detailed notes about her condition. It was all there, carefully documented. David had been researching her illness. He had been working to find a cure or treatment. He had been doing it all in secret. Mariah's head spun. This wasn't about infidelity. It wasn't about betrayal in the way she had thought. It was something else entirely. He had been hiding the truth, but for a reason that had nothing to do with cheating. Before she could process everything, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Panic surged through her, and Mariah quickly shoved the papers back into the folder, locking the office door behind her. She was breathing heavily, her heart racing as she glanced around for a place to hide. There was no time. The footsteps were too close. In a split second, she dove behind the large couch near the window, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She held her breath, praying that whoever was coming wouldn't find her. A moment later, the door to the office creaked open. Mariah's pulse raced. She couldn't believe she was hiding in her own husband's office, afraid of being caught snooping. She held her breath, waiting to see who it was. The door shut behind the person, and Mariah dared to peek out from her hiding spot. It was a man, someone she didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and an intense look on his face. He walked to the desk and opened the folder Mariah had just looked through. What was going on here? Who was this person? Her mind raced as she stayed hidden, trying to understand the situation. The answers were slipping away faster than she could grasp them. This wasn't just about secrets. This was about something bigger. Something David was involved in that she couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was certain. Today, the truth was closer than ever. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Mariah remained perfectly still, her breath shallow and fast, as she peered over the edge of the couch. The man who had entered David's office was standing at the desk, flipping through the very folder she had just examined. The man's movements were deliberate, almost too controlled, as if he had done this 100 times before. She could hear the faint rustling of paper as he read through the documents. The same medical records, the ones that had sent her heart into overdrive. He wasn't supposed to be here. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man was close enough that any noise she made might expose her hiding spot. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest, the tension in the room almost suffocating. Who was this man? And why was he looking at those records? She glanced at the door, wondering if she could make a quick escape. But the second the man turned his head and scanned the room, her pulse skyrocketed. He was looking for something, or someone. And she knew, without a doubt, that he would find her if she didn't act quickly. Her eyes flicked to the window. She knew the office was on the top floor of the building, but if she could just get out onto the balcony, maybe there was a chance to slip away before he noticed her. It was a gamble, but she had little choice. The man was too close. She moved with quiet precision, sliding out from her hiding spot and inching her way toward the balcony door. The man didn't seem to hear her. He was too absorbed in whatever he was reading on the desk. Mariah's heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She reached the door and carefully turned the handle. But just as she was about to step outside, she heard the man's voice, low and filled with authority. "David, you hear?" The words sent a chill through her, and she froze. The man wasn't talking to her. He was talking to David. Her stomach twisted. David. He was coming. She had no idea if he was alone, or if this man was just some employee of his. All she knew was that she couldn't be caught here. Not like this. Not after everything. Without another second to waste, she pushed the door open, stepping out onto the balcony just as she heard the sound of the office door opening behind her. The cool breeze hit her face, sharp and refreshing, as she quickly crouched down behind the railing to stay out of sight. Her body was tense as she waited, barely able to breathe as she listened to the conversation unfolding inside. "Did you find anything?" David's voice was suddenly clear, and Mariah felt her chest tighten as she recognized the weariness in it. He had been working with this man. He knew him. "Yes. The serum is ready. The shipment's been confirmed. We're just waiting for the last piece," the man responded. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge to it, a sense of urgency that didn't sit well with Mariah. "What do you mean, the last piece?" David's voice was edged with concern now. "She's going to start treatment soon. We can't risk anything going wrong." The words hit Mariah like a punch to the gut. Treatment. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Had he been preparing something for her? The medical files, the research, it wasn't about him. It was about her. The realization sent a flood of emotions crashing over her. Confusion, relief, and above all, a wave of disbelief. David had been hiding something, not because of infidelity, but because he was trying to save her. Trying to save her from a fate she hadn't even known was waiting for her. But there was still so much she didn't understand. What treatment? What was this serum they were talking about? And why hadn't David told her? "I told you, David, we need to move fast," the man continued. "Time's running out." "I know," David said, his voice softer now. I don't know how to tell her. I don't know if I can. This wasn't supposed to be the way." Mariah's heart stopped. The words pierced through her, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed with shock. He didn't know how to tell her. Had he been keeping this secret from her out of fear? Out of love? She couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers. Before she could second-guess herself, Mariah pushed open the door and stepped back into the office. The moment she entered, David and the man froze, their eyes widening in shock. The folder on the desk was still open, its contents spilling out. David's face went pale when he saw her. "Mariah," he said, his voice strained. "What are you doing here? Why didn't you tell me?" Mariah's voice was quiet, but the hurt was evident. "What's all this? Why are you keeping this from me? Why are you researching my illness? What's going on?" David's expression faltered, And for the first time, Mariah saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. The man beside him looked nervous, his gaze darting between the two of them. He had the look of someone who was not supposed to be seen. Mariah, David started, but he couldn't finish. His words hung in the air, tangled in uncertainty and regret. "You've been hiding this from me, David," she said, the anger and hurt welling up in her throat. "Why? You're telling me now that you've been working on something for me? That this treatment, it's for me? I had no idea. You've been lying to me this whole time." "Why?" The man spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't understand, Mariah. Your condition, it's more serious than you know. David has been trying to save you. He's been trying to get the cure for you. He didn't want to burden you with it. That's why he's been acting the way he has. It's not what you think." Mariah's world tilted as the man's words sank in. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt dizzy. What do you mean, my condition? What's happening to me?" David took a step forward, his face pleading. "Mariah, I didn't want you to know. I wanted to protect you from the truth, from the fear. Your doctors," he broke off, struggling to find the words. "They've only given you a few months. But I couldn't tell you. I couldn't just sit there and watch you go through it. I wanted to find a way to save you." The ground beneath Mariah's feet felt like it was slipping away. A few months. The weight of those words was unbearable. She couldn't comprehend it. You knew this whole time, and you didn't tell me." David's eyes were filled with unshed tears now, his voice breaking. "I wanted to protect you. I wanted to keep you safe. I thought if I could just find the right treatment, if I could just make it in time." Mariah's mind was reeling. Her heart was torn between shock and something else, something warmer, softer. David hadn't been hiding from her. He had been protecting her. But the secrecy, the lies, it all hurt more than she could have imagined. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can understand why you kept this from me." David nodded, his expression hollow. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mariah. I just need you to know that everything I did was for you. For us." The room was heavy with the weight of their emotions, the silence pressing in. But through the confusion, through the whirlwind of disbelief and betrayal, Mariah felt one thing above all: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. Chapter 5. The Choice. Mariah's mind swirled with disbelief, her body frozen in the tension of the moment. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as she stared at David, the man who had kept this enormous secret from her. Her heart ached with the weight of the revelation. He hadn't just been distant. He hadn't been hiding something trivial. He had been hiding her fate. She looked down at the folder in front of her, the medical papers strewn about with her name on them. Everything she had seen felt unreal. A part of her wanted to scream, to demand that David explain how this could have happened, why he hadn't told her sooner. Another part of her simply wanted to crumble to the floor and give in to the overwhelming sadness. But instead, she stood still, staring at him as if he were a stranger. "David," her voice broke. She didn't know what to say. There was so much that needed to be said, so many questions that begged for answers. But her mind was racing, and all she could hear were the words the man had said. A few months. A few months of her life remaining. A timeline she never even knew she had. David's face was pale, his eyes desperate for her understanding. "Mariah, please. I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't know how to tell you." The man standing next to David, the one who had entered the office so quietly before, now an unexpected participant in the unraveling of her world, cleared his throat. "David's right. He didn't want to burden you with the truth until he had something that could help. He's been working with the top specialists to develop a treatment, but it's experimental. And it's not ready yet." "What's experimental? What are you talking about?" Mariah's voice shook with confusion, her thoughts a jumbled mess. The man, who David had called Greg, stepped forward cautiously. He looked at her with a mix of sympathy and regret. There's a serum, a treatment, that could slow down the progression of your condition. It's not a cure, not yet, but it could buy us time. We're still working on it. But it's still in its early stages. That's why David hasn't told you. He didn't want to give you false hope. Mariah's legs suddenly felt weak. She gripped the back of the chair beside her to steady herself. This was too much, too fast. She hadn't been prepared for any of this. Just a few days ago, she had been going about her life as if everything was fine. Now, she was facing the reality of a disease she hadn't even known existed. A disease that was silently destroying her body. She looked at David, her heart aching with a mix of sorrow and anger. He had kept her in the dark, had shielded her from something that was a matter of life and death. And for what? To protect her? To spare her the pain? But why had he thought he could handle this on his own? I don't understand, Mariah whispered. Why didn't you just tell me? Why keep it a secret? I would have wanted to face it with you. David took a step closer, his face full of pain. I thought I was protecting you, Mariah. I thought if I could find a way to fix it, you wouldn't have to know. I was trying to keep you safe, keep you from worrying about something that might not even happen. But I see now how wrong I was. The tears that had been threatening to spill for so long finally came. They fell silently down her cheeks as she reached for the chair, trying to steady herself. David's betrayal. No, not betrayal, she realized. His silence had been rooted in love. It didn't make it hurt less, but it was harder to hate him for it. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. I don't know if I can face it. If I can trust you again. If I can believe in anything, after all of this. David's voice cracked with emotion. Mariah, please. I would do anything to make this right. Anything. The weight of his words pressed heavily on her heart, but she couldn't let go of the rawness of the moment. She had a choice now. A choice to make, a path to decide, and it wasn't one she had ever imagined herself having to face. Greg, sensing the delicate nature of the conversation, stepped back and gave them some space. His gaze lingered on Mariah for a moment, almost as though he was waiting for her to speak. She wiped the tears from her face and looked at him, then at David. Do you really think this treatment will work? She asked, her voice trembling but firm. David nodded quickly. Yes, I do. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think there was hope. I know it's not a cure, but it could slow down the progression, maybe even give us years more. And every day matters. I need you to trust me, Mariah. Please. We can fight this together. Mariah felt a surge of conflicting emotions flood her. Anger, fear, desperation. But above all, she felt a flicker of hope, the kind she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. If she took this step, if she accepted what David had done and worked with him, she would be taking a leap into the unknown. The road ahead was uncertain. The treatment might not work. It could cause harm. It could be a waste of time. But it could also be her chance at survival. She looked at David, her gaze steady but searching. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, she said, her voice small but resolute. But I'll try. I want to fight. I need to fight. But you have to promise me one thing. David's eyes locked onto hers, a silent plea in his expression. Anything. You won't keep things from me anymore, Mariah said, her voice cracking with the intensity of her emotions. You have to promise that you'll be honest with me. No more secrets. David's face softened with relief, and he took a step forward, reaching out for her hand. I promise. No more secrets. I'll be by your side every step of the way. Whatever you decide, we do it together. Mariah nodded, her tears still falling. It wasn't the resolution she had expected. It wasn't the perfect, clear-cut answer she had wanted. But it was a beginning. A fragile, tentative beginning that she had to trust, or at least try to. Okay, she whispered, squeezing his hand. Let's try. Let's see if we can fight this. David's face lit with something like hope, and in that moment, Mariah knew that their journey, however painful, however uncertain, was just beginning. But at least they were facing it together now. The door to the office opened, and Greg looked back at them, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "We'll make the arrangements, David. We'll start as soon as we can." As Greg left the room, Mariah felt the weight of the situation settle in. The choice had been made. Now, it was a matter of moving forward, of trusting in the unknown and hoping that the treatments would work. She couldn't promise herself that she wouldn't have doubts or fears, but for now, she had made the only decision that made sense. Together, they would fight. Together, they would see what the future could hold. And that was enough for now. Chapter 6. The Leap of Faith. It had been a week since Mariah had made the decision to begin the treatment, and each day felt like a slow progression into an unfamiliar world. David had been true to his word, his presence unwavering, though the shadows of guilt still lingered in his eyes whenever he looked at her. He had been careful to explain everything. The risks, the potential benefits, the uncertainty. But no matter how many times he reassured her, the fear never fully left. Mariah had begun the injections. The serum, though untested in the way David hoped it would work, had been administered carefully under the supervision of Greg and a team of specialists. It wasn't a cure, no one was promising her that, but it was the only option, the only hope they had. She had agreed to go along with it, unsure if the decision was brave or reckless, but she trusted David. And for now, that trust was enough. But trust, Mariah was learning, was a fragile thing. That night, David was unusually quiet. As she prepared for bed, she noticed the way his shoulders slumped, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on him. Mariah couldn't remember the last time they'd truly spoken without the undercurrent of tension, without the shadow of secrets hanging between them. "David," she called softly, her voice almost drowned by the soft hum of the air conditioning. "Are you okay?" He looked up from his place by the window, where he had been staring out into the dimly lit cityscape. There was something distant in his gaze, something that made Mariah's heart skip. "Yeah, just thinking." Mariah stood up and walked toward him, feeling the distance between them more acutely than she had in a long time. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Talk to me," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" David let out a slow breath, his eyes dark with the weight of unspoken words. "It's just, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can ever undo the hurt I've caused you." Mariah's heart twisted. She hadn't expected him to say that, not after everything they'd been through. It was as though the truth of what had happened in the past few weeks, the lies, the secrets, was too much for him to bear alone. "I don't need you to fix it, David," she said softly, her fingers tracing circles on his back. "I need you to be here. With me. I'm scared, too. But we can do this together." David's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had always been there for her, even when she didn't ask. He nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." But even as he spoke those words, Mariah felt the nagging sense that something was still missing. Her thoughts drifted back to the day she had overheard that conversation, the conversation that had shaken her to her core. She had heard the urgency in David's voice when he spoke to Greg. The serum was important, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he had told her. "David," she began cautiously, her voice low and hesitant. "Is there something you're still hiding from me? Something important?" David stiffened at the question, and the sudden silence that fell between them was thick with unspoken tension. He turned away, his eyes distant again, as though she had asked him a question he wasn't ready to answer. "I've told you everything I can, Mariah," he said quietly, but there was an edge to his voice now, one she hadn't heard before. Mariah's heart began to pound. She took a step closer to him, her hand reaching out to gently turn his face toward hers. "I'm not asking for all the details, but I need to know, David. Are you hiding something that could affect me?" His silence was enough of an answer. "I'm doing this because I trust you," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "But if there's something more, something I need to know, you have to tell me. I can't go into this blindly. Not anymore." David finally looked at her, his eyes filled with regret and sorrow. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to get caught in his throat. It was as if he wanted to tell her everything, wanted to come clean, but something was holding him back. "Mariah, I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice shaky. "There's a reason I've been so careful with you. There's a reason I've kept this treatment secret for so long." She could feel her breath catch in her throat. "What are you saying?" David swallowed hard, as though the weight of his confession was choking him. "The serum. It's not just experimental. It's dangerous. It's been shown to have unpredictable side effects. And it's not just a treatment. It could be the last hope for anyone with your condition, but only if it works. If it doesn't," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mariah's chest tightened. "What do you mean, if it doesn't? What could happen?" David's face was pale, his eyes filled with anguish. "It could make things worse. It could accelerate the illness. It could hurt you." Mariah felt as if the world was crumbling beneath her feet. Everything she had believed, everything she had trusted, suddenly felt like it was slipping away. The fear she had been pushing down rose to the surface in a tide of panic. "So, you're telling me you've been giving me something that might kill me?" Her voice was barely audible, raw with the shock of his confession. No, that's not what I'm saying," David quickly protested, reaching out for her. "I don't think it will. I'm just telling you the truth. I've had to weigh the risks. But I thought if we could just get it right, if we could give it a chance, you might have a future. I was willing to risk everything for you. For us." Mariah stepped back, her breath ragged. She needed space. She needed to think. The trust she had so carefully rebuilt, so willingly placed in him, felt like it was unraveling. "I need to think, David," she whispered, turning away. He didn't try to stop her. Instead, he watched her walk toward the door, his face filled with regret, guilt, and love, emotions she couldn't even process right now. Mariah stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air rushing over her as she tried to collect herself. Her heart was beating erratically in her chest, and the weight of David's words felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on her. She felt betrayed, confused, and terrified of what the future might hold. But through the turmoil, one thought remained: she couldn't give up yet. She couldn't let the fear of the unknown paralyze her. There was still a chance, a sliver of hope, and no matter how difficult, she had to decide whether she was willing to take that leap of faith. The treatment, the serum, the uncertainty. It was all part of the journey now. The decision wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Mariah had to make it herself. Chapter 7. The breaking point. Mariah had always believed that the hardest decisions came with time, that if she waited long enough, the right answers would reveal themselves. But now, standing on the edge of uncertainty, she knew that time had run out. David's confession weighed on her every waking moment, and the quiet of the night only made it worse. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over again. The serum. The risks. The possibility that it could make things worse. The promises he had made. Promises that felt like they were slipping through her fingers. Her mind raced with what-ifs. What if the treatment didn't work? What if it made her condition worse, as David feared? Was it worth the risk? And yet, what if it was the only thing that could save her? The uncertainty felt suffocating. Every corner of her mind was clouded with the weight of the decision. There was no easy way forward, no clear path. The thought of continuing with the treatment, of trusting in David's judgment, felt like stepping into the unknown, with no guarantee of safety or survival. But to stop, to refuse it, meant giving up on the hope she had clung to for so long. Mariah couldn't bring herself to close her eyes without the fear that this decision would haunt her for the rest of her life. Every choice seemed to carry the weight of her future, and she was terrified of making the wrong one. The house felt unusually quiet, as if it, too, understood the gravity of the moment. Her mind spun out of control, and the more she thought, the more it felt like she was drowning in her own thoughts. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke through her spiraling thoughts. Mariah sat up with a start, her heart racing. It was early morning, and she hadn't expected anyone. "Mariah." David's voice came through the door, his tone tentative. She wiped her eyes quickly, hoping he hadn't heard the soft sobs she had been trying to hold back. "Yeah, I just wanted to talk. Please. Can I come in?" Mariah hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to face him right now, to hear more of the same soothing words he had given her the night before. But she knew that avoiding the conversation wouldn't help either of them. She swung her legs off the bed and stood up, walking slowly to the door. When she opened it, David stood in the hallway, looking exhausted, his eyes filled with concern. He was dressed in his usual casual clothes, but his posture was stiff, as though he wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get. "David," her voice faltered as she spoke, her emotions tangled inside of her. "I don't know what to do anymore." He stepped forward, his expression softening with guilt and sorrow. I know you're scared, Mariah. I'm scared too. But please, let me explain. Let me try to help you understand why I made the decisions I did." She nodded slowly, stepping back to let him in. He entered the room and closed the door gently behind him. "Sit with me," David asked, motioning toward the bed. Mariah complied, though the space between them felt wide, like an abyss neither of them knew how to cross. She sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze averted from him. "Look," David began, his voice low and steady. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to make you feel like you couldn't trust me. But when I found out what was happening to you, when I found out how serious it was, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose you. And I was desperate to find something, anything, that could give us more time." Mariah felt a lump form in her throat. "But you didn't trust me enough to tell me, David. I could have helped you. We could have figured it out together." "I know," he said softly, his voice cracking. "I should have told you from the start. But I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I kept it a secret, if I just found the right solution, then you wouldn't have to carry that weight. But it was wrong. It was so wrong, Mariah. And I'm so sorry." Mariah closed her eyes, fighting back the tears. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel like everything would be okay, but the hurt ran deep. The betrayal wasn't just about the secret. It was about how she had been left in the dark, as though she wasn't strong enough to handle the truth. "I don't know if I can forgive you, David," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know if I can trust you again." David nodded, his face etched with regret. "I understand. I've broken your trust, and I know it's going to take time to rebuild that. But I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Mariah. I will do whatever it takes to prove that to you." She let his words settle in, unsure of how to respond. The pain of the past week, of the uncertainty surrounding her diagnosis and treatment, had left her emotionally raw. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the weight of their relationship, not after everything that had happened. David continued, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The truth is, I'm scared too. I don't know if the treatment will work. I don't know what will happen, and I can't promise you that everything will be okay. But what I can promise is that I will be here, no matter what." Mariah looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in days. His face, usually so sure and confident, was now filled with vulnerability. The man she had loved was standing before her, unsure, afraid, and broken, just like she was. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. "I want to believe you, David. I really do. But I need time to think. I need to figure out if I can trust you again. If I can trust myself." He nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "I'll give you all the time you need. But just know I'm here. Whatever you decide, I'm here." Mariah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decision once more. But in that moment, she realized something important. The choice wasn't just about whether to continue the treatment or not. It was about whether she was willing to trust again, whether she could heal from the hurt and fear that had taken root in her heart. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time since everything had started to unravel, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start moving forward. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Visitor. The following days felt like a haze, a blur of appointments, injections, and whispered conversations in the halls of her home. Mariah couldn't shake the constant weight that pressed against her chest. It was there, in the corners of her thoughts, every time she tried to relax, every time she attempted to ignore the ticking clock of her life. She wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the way she had been. The fury that had initially burned inside of her had cooled into a quiet ache. What she felt now was uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that took root in your heart and clung to you no matter how hard you tried to shake it. The questions she had once screamed at David had shifted to quieter ones she asked only of herself. Was she strong enough to trust again? Was she willing to risk everything for the possibility of a future that might never come? Every answer she reached seemed to lead to more questions, and the fear of making the wrong choice never truly left her. Yet, in the midst of this swirling storm, something unexpected happened, something that shifted the entire course of her life. It was a Tuesday morning when the knock at the door came. Mariah was sitting at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee. Her gaze was lost in the swirling steam, trying desperately to find a moment of clarity. The doorbell echoed through the quiet house, snapping her out of her thoughts. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, the stillness that enveloped her as she wrestled with her decision. But the knock came again, more urgent this time. David was out running errands, and the house felt emptier than usual. With a sigh, Mariah rose from the table and walked to the door, her thoughts already drifting back to the uncertainty of the past few days. As she reached for the doorknob, she froze, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing on the porch, was a figure she hadn't expected to see. A woman, her eyes tired but sharp, her presence as commanding as it was unexpected. Mariah. The woman's voice was low, almost cautious. Can we talk? Mariah blinked, taking in the sight of this stranger. The woman was tall, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing a simple black dress. She exuded an air of both warmth and authority, and something about her made Mariah instinctively take a step back. Yes, Mariah asked, though her voice trembled slightly, uncertain of what this visitor wanted. Can I help you? The woman's expression softened. I'm Dr. Angela Matthews. I've been working with your husband, David. The mention of David's name caught Mariah off guard. Her heart skipped a beat. David, she echoed, her confusion growing. Why are you here? What's going on? Dr. Matthews hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder as though ensuring no one else was watching. I know this is a surprise, but I need to speak with you. It's about the treatment. Mariah's stomach twisted at the mention of the serum. What about it? Dr. Matthews stepped forward, her voice quiet but urgent. It's not what you think. The serum, the risks, the secrecy, it's all part of something bigger. David didn't tell you everything. And I'm afraid he's in over his head. Mariah's pulse quickened, her mind racing with questions. She stepped aside, allowing the doctor into the house, her thoughts spinning. What do you mean? What isn't he telling me? Dr. Matthews took a seat at the kitchen table, her expression grim. It's hard to explain, but I'll try. David has been working on a project for months, something that's far more dangerous than anyone knew. The serum he's been giving you, it's part of an experimental protocol. He was told it was the only hope, but the reality is that it's untested and has never been properly vetted. Mariah felt a cold chill creep up her spine. So it's not safe, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Matthews met her gaze. It's not just that. The serum, while it has potential, was rushed into development without proper oversight. And there are side effects. The kind of side effects that can destroy your immune system instead of boosting it. Mariah felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting. This was the kind of news she had been dreading. The kind of truth that threatened to unravel everything she had believed. Why didn't he tell me this? Mariah asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Why didn't he warn me? Dr. Matthews shook her head. Because he's afraid. David's doing everything he can to fix this, but he's trapped. He thought he was protecting you by keeping you in the dark. But the truth is, he didn't want you to know how bad it was. He didn't want to lose you. Mariah felt a lump form in her throat. It was as though the world was closing in on her, the weight of the secret hanging over her, suffocating her. She had trusted David, had believed in him when all the signs pointed to a future full of possibility. And now she was being told that everything had been built on a lie. Are you saying that I shouldn't continue the treatment? Mariah's voice cracked as she asked the question. Dr. Matthews didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the floor, as though searching for the right words. I'm not here to tell you what to do. But I will tell you this. You have options. You don't have to go down this path if you don't want to. The serum is not the only way. Mariah's heart hammered in her chest. Then what should I do? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the enormity of the decision she was facing. Dr. Matthews leaned forward, her eyes filled with compassion. You have to make the choice for yourself, Mariah. Don't let anyone, not even David, decide this for you. But I will help you find the truth, no matter what. Mariah sat back, her mind reeling with the weight of everything she had just learned. She had trusted David, had believed in his love and in the choices he made for their future. But now, with this revelation, the world she had so carefully built with him seemed to be falling apart. I don't know what to think anymore, she whispered, her voice full of fear. Dr. Matthews placed a hand gently on hers, her touch grounding. You don't have to have all the answers right now, but I will be here to help you figure them out. I promise you that. As Mariah sat in silence, the enormity of the situation washed over her. Everything had changed in an instant. And for the first time in a long time, she realized that the future was no longer something she could wait for. It was something she would have to shape for herself. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The house felt different after Dr. Matthews left. The quiet seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the truth that had been revealed. Mariah stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours, her hands frozen at her sides as the shock of the conversation slowly sank in. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the very foundation of her reality to be shaken so violently. It was as if someone had taken the life she had carefully built with David and tossed it into the air, letting the pieces fall to the ground like shattered glass. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts racing through the labyrinth of possibilities. The serum, the secret, the lies David had kept from her, the fear that had driven him to make decisions she could never have imagined. How could he have kept all of this from her? How could he have put her at risk without telling her the truth? And then there was the most pressing question of all. What should she do now? Mariah couldn't keep running away from the decision. She had been avoiding it for days, hoping that something, anything, would give her a clear answer. But now, there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and she had to face it head-on. The front door creaked open, and Mariah didn't have to turn to know it was David. She could feel his presence, his aura of guilt and hesitation that had become all too familiar. She heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallway. Mariah. His voice was tentative, hesitant, as though he were afraid to approach her. We need to talk. She didn't move. She didn't look at him. She simply stayed in the same spot, her eyes fixed on the countertop, her mind still racing with the conversation she had just had. David stepped into the kitchen, the tension thick between them. Mariah could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the apology in his eyes, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He was too afraid to say what they both knew needed to be said. I know you're upset, he began quietly, his voice strained. And I know I've lied to you. But I never wanted to hurt you, Mariah. I never wanted to put you in danger. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I was protecting you." Mariah finally turned to face him, her eyes cold and sharp. She had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so broken. But it didn't matter. The hurt was too deep, and the betrayal too fresh. "You think lying to me was protecting me?" Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "David, how could you? How could you keep something like this from me? I trusted you." David flinched, as if her words had physically struck him. His face fell, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I know, and I hate myself for it. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was so afraid of losing you, Mariah. I thought if I could just make this work, if I could find a way to fix everything, maybe I could make it right." Mariah took a step back, shaking her head. "You didn't give me a choice, David. You didn't let me in. You kept me in the dark about everything. And now, you want me to just forgive you?" David reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to close the distance between them. "Please, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I love you, Mariah. And I will do whatever it takes to fix this. To fix us." She took a deep breath, the emotions swirling inside her, refusing to settle. "Love," she repeated bitterly. "Do you even know what love is, David? Because love isn't hiding the truth. Love isn't keeping someone in the dark, thinking that they can't handle the reality of what's happening." David's expression faltered, and for a moment, he seemed to shrink under her gaze. But he didn't step away. He didn't back down. Instead, he took a deep breath, as though summoning the courage to say what needed to be said. "You're right," he said softly, his voice raw. "I've failed you. And I'm sorry. But I don't want to lose you. Not like this." Mariah closed her eyes, the sting of his words sinking deep into her chest. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to throw everything he had done back in his face. But another part, a part that still loved him, no matter how much it hurt, wanted to understand, to find a way to heal the cracks that had formed between them. She wasn't sure what to do. She wasn't sure if she could forgive him, or if she even wanted to. But she knew one thing. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep being afraid of the choices she had to make. "What am I supposed to do now, David?" Her voice was soft, almost defeated. "What am I supposed to believe?" David stepped closer, his gaze filled with desperation. "You don't have to make a decision right now. But please, just let me show you that I can fix this. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." Mariah shook her head slowly, the weight of the decision still pressing on her. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can believe that you're not hiding more from me." David's face crumpled in despair, and for the first time, Mariah saw the full extent of his fear, not just for the treatment, but for their relationship, for everything they had been through. She had seen him at his best, at his strongest. But now, all she saw was a man who had made a mistake, one that could destroy them both. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered again, his voice shaking. "I'm begging you, Mariah. Please." She felt her heart twist. Part of her wanted to hold him, to tell him that everything would be okay, that they would find a way to make it work. But another part of her, the part that was still hurt, still angry, wanted to walk away and never look back. Mariah stood there for a long moment, the silence between them deafening. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. The decision was too big, too overwhelming. It wasn't something she could rush. But she knew one thing. She couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. With a heavy sigh, she turned away from him and walked toward the window. The world outside was quiet, serene even, and for a moment, Mariah allowed herself to be lost in the stillness. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I need to figure it out. For myself." David didn't say anything at first. But when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost pleading. "Take all the time you need, Mariah. I'll be here. Whenever you're ready." She didn't respond, but her chest tightened. She was unsure of what the future would hold. But one thing was clear: the path ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time, and it would take trust, but she had to find a way forward. For herself. And somehow, maybe, just maybe, for them too. Chapter 10. The Choice. It had been days since the conversation with David, and Mariah felt as if she had been living in limbo. Every decision, every thought seemed to hinge on that one question. What now? She had told David that she needed time, but time had only made the uncertainty more suffocating. The house felt different now. The silence between them was palpable, thick with the unspoken things they both carried. She had thought she could ignore the weight of the choice that hung over her. She had thought that with distance, clarity would come. But it hadn't. Every corner of her life was infused with the echoes of what was happening. She caught herself thinking of the past, of all the times David had held her, promised her a future, and assured her that they would face anything together. She had believed him. But now, with the betrayal hanging in the air like a dark cloud, she didn't know who to trust, him or herself. Her body was weak. She had become accustomed to the constant fatigue, the pain that was always present, though she tried not to show it. There were moments when the sickness crept up on her with a force she couldn't ignore, and the fear would come rushing back, making her heart race. Was she running out of time? It was late in the afternoon when the knock on the door came, just as it had on the day Dr. Matthews had arrived. Mariah was sitting on the couch, her hands resting on her lap as she stared blankly at the window. It was as if she had become a spectator in her own life, watching as everything unfolded around her, but unsure of how to be part of it. She didn't move at first. The knock sounded again, a bit more insistent this time. She sighed, pushing herself up from the couch. As she walked to the door, her heart started to race, but she didn't know why. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Dr. Matthews standing there, her face serious, her expression urgent. "Mariah, can we talk?" Dr. Matthews asked, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Mariah's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "I need to tell you something," Dr. Matthews said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "Something important. It's about David." Mariah's chest tightened, and for the briefest moment, she thought she might turn and run. But something inside her urged her to stay. No more secrets. Not now. She gestured for Dr. Matthews to sit, and they both lowered themselves onto the couch. "What is it?" Dr. Matthews hesitated, her eyes searching for the right words. "You need to understand something. When David came to me for help, I had no idea what I was getting into. I knew the serum was experimental, but I had no idea the full scope of what it could do. He didn't tell me everything, either." Mariah's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" I thought he was trying to save me." "He was," Dr. Matthews said quickly. "But there's more to it. The treatment, the serum, it's not just about prolonging life. It's not just about treating the disease. The truth is, it has the potential to cure it. But it comes at a cost." Mariah's heart skipped a beat. "A cost? What do you mean?" Dr. Matthews leaned forward, her face etched with worry. "There are risks, Mariah. Big ones. And David knew. He knew about them. But he didn't want to tell you because he couldn't bear the thought of losing you. The serum can alter your body in ways we don't fully understand. And there's a possibility that the changes could be irreversible." Mariah felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. "So you're telling me that the serum might not just save me. It might. It might make things worse." Dr. Matthews nodded slowly, her voice gentle but firm. "It could. But it could also work. It could do exactly what David hoped it would. There's a chance that it could cure you. But you need to make the decision. It's your choice." The weight of those words was unbearable. Your choice, it seemed so simple, Yet it was the most difficult thing she had ever been asked to do. Dr. Matthews stood up and walked to the window, her back turned as she spoke again. I know this is a lot to process. And I know it's hard, but I'm here for you, Mariah. You don't have to do this alone. Mariah didn't respond immediately. She was thinking, processing the enormity of the decision. The cure. The risk. She didn't know how to feel about either option. Could she trust the serum? Could she trust David? She thought of the man who had stood by her through everything. The man who had kept her close even when things seemed hopeless. She thought of his love for her, of his desperation to save her. She knew deep down that David had acted out of love. But that didn't make everything okay. That didn't take away the fact that he had lied to her. Dr. Matthews's voice broke through her thoughts. Mariah, whatever you decide, just know that it's your life. You have the power to choose. And I'll support you no matter what. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy. She had spent so long in a state of fear and uncertainty, but now, for the first time in ages, she felt a flicker of clarity. She could make this decision. She could take control. With a deep breath, Mariah stood up and walked to the door. She opened it slowly, turning to face Dr. Matthews one last time. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me the truth. For giving me the chance to decide. Dr. Matthews smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. You're welcome. Just know that you're not alone. Whatever you choose, we'll face it together. As Dr. Matthews left, Mariah stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. The weight of the decision still hung in the air, but now, she felt a sense of peace settling inside of her. She would make the decision that was best for her. She would trust herself, no matter what came next. And for the first time in weeks, she felt ready to face whatever the future held.